Hi everyone, welcome to Mumsu Code video guide session. In the previous video, we created our logging broker so that we will be able to handle all the failures that is happening, not just failures, any other information, traces, warning that we want to log in our application. So now we are back to our foundations add. Let's first get the main branch merged into this branch because for this activity, I need my logging broker. So here I am. Let me merge into current branch. Okay. Yeah, so I have my 3 commits. Now let's go write our failing test. So what we wanted to do is under services, foundations, samples. So far we have done our happy path. Recap, the happy path means we're assuming that the user or the caller for this particular service is going to give us all the valid data so that the system is going to save the data and return it. Now we're going to focus on things that are not going to work as expected. So whenever we are developing our software, we will have to develop in zero trust. What it means is plan for the worst case. So assume and handle all possible scenarios that can occur in the system so that if at all it occurs, we have this system to handle it. Okay, so let me go add the partial class. Since we are leveraging partial classes for separating the logic, so these set of test cases will be falling under validations. So here, sample service test your validations dot, and the operation that I'm going to work on is add and then the extension. Yeah, as usual, this is expecting the partial modifier. Okay, I have it here. Now what I want to do is start with a test. So fact going to be a public modifier and the test is going to be a task for execution. Then what I'm going to do is the name. So I'm expecting should through validation exception on at if. So we have a lot of scenarios that we have to handle in case of errors. So now what we are going to say is the first scenario is going to be if my entity sample is null. Not just this, whenever an error occurs, I'm expecting the system to log some data. So and log it. So this is the test I'm going to write, which is going to be self-explanatory. So resolve this one. Okay. So I'm saying this test should throw. So since it is an error, we are saying it has throw. Let's say if it's a normal entity, it's going to be returned, right? So I'm explicitly saying that this test should throw an error. So that means an exception. That is the type in the C#. So it should throw an exception. What type of exception? It should throw a validation exception. So I'm trying to validate the data, validate the input that the user or the caller is going to be passing in for this service. And on what type of operation, like is it going to be an add, delete, retrieve, select, whatnot, right? So here I'm going to add it. When should this validation exception should be thrown? If my sample is my entity, my model here is null and log it. So whenever there is an error, you throw it and then log it. Okay. So now the frame for our test given when then. So we will do this particular test in a twofold since this is the first validation test that we will be writing here. So this video is going to cover given and when. In the next video, we'll be covering the then section. Okay. So coming to the when part, this is my style of coding where I start from the when part and then I build the given part. So what I'm testing here. I'm going to test my sample service. And the method that I'm going to test is add sample. And I'm going to pass in some data. Now I'm going to pass in some wrong data, right? What type of wrong data I'm going to pass? I'm going to pass some null data. So just giving a meaningful name here, null sample. Let's prepare the null sample. So sample, null sample. Let's take into namespace. So sample, null sample equal null. You can go have and say invalid sample or just sample or some sample, anything, right? I'm just giving it a meaningful name saying that, hey, this particular value is null. Okay, so next, we have prepared our when section which says, okay, I'm going to call you with this null value, and then this is my null value that I'm going to pass in. Now, the next step that we have to prepare is whatever we are going to validate when this method is going to return. Because we are expecting this method to return a validation exception. When it returns, you need to hold that and then verify it against something, right? So we're going to prepare that expected value so that we are ready to validate it when we receive the message. Okay, so let's get into the diagram to understand what type of contract that we are going to establish when these errors happen. Okay, so we're going to prepare something, right? So let me grab some boxes here. So what I'm saying is this is my broker. And for now, I'm just going to use this diagram, but we are using a in-memory storage, right? So storage. So this one is here. Then I have my foundation, which is going to talk to the broker. Okay, so for the left-hand side of it, we also talked about what is this. So it's going to be exposed. This one is going to connect with the foundation service. And let's assume this is a user who's talking to this. Now what we are focused on is this foundation service. When this foundation service receives the call from its exposer and the data is invalid, and what should it return? So far we have seen the happy path, right? So it is giving some data, it's validating it, and it's persisting it in the storage. And then when it is returning back, it's returning the data itself. But in this case, there's a failure going to happen, right? So what will be that contract that's going to be given back to this exposer whenever there is an error occur? So here what we're going to call this one as, so let's assume that for now, null value is being passed. I'm going to pass an exception. And then what if some other error happens, right? Some other type of invalid data is being passed. And again, we call it as exception. So if we keep calling all the errors in just one single category, that's just exception, then it's not going to be easy for us to locate exactly where this has happened. It's not going to be an easy task as the system grows along. Then you can have multiple type of combinations happening here, right? So for that purpose, what we're going to do is name this very much specific to the error that's going to happen in the system. What is that standard going to be? So we can say, what's the error about? And then we can say, what's the entity? And then we can go with exception because this is an exception. So in our case, what we're working on is this error is nothing but null. For now, I'm testing the null values. Then my entity is sample. Okay. So now if you see this particular contract or this particular exception that is going to be moving across the calls is very much specific to the error that's happened in the system, right? So next time when we have another error happening, we'll construct something meaningful, pass that as the response whenever the error occurs. Okay, well, now let's go to our code and prepare this null sample exception. Here we are. So I'm going to prepare my null sample exception. So this is going to be var null sample exception is my variable name. And this is going to be a class, right? So I'm creating an object for it. Null sample exception. Okay. Since this is not defined, let's go define it. Control C. The place where we will be defining. So this is again going to be serving the purpose of contract, right? The communication between the caller and the callee. So the position will be under models and what entity is this? And then we will be having a lot of exceptions that we're going to handle. So just to put them into groups, exceptions. So the actual entity is at the root folder, and then we have one nested folder for exceptions. So I'm going to add the class here. Okay. Now what am I going to do? I'm going to say this particular class is of type exception. And this is a library that I need to install. So let me right click here, manage NuGet package. This is the library. This one is going to help us in some meaningful translation and handling of the exceptions. Okay, looks like it's there. Yeah. Okay, so here I'm establishing the, type of this null sample exception to be of type exception. It's going to be a tongue twister when we're going to say exception. So I'll try my best to say exception and then exception. Okay, so to avoid the confusion. Okay, so now what we want to do is whenever this particular entity or this particular object is being created, I want to give a message which is going to serve as the error message. That I'm going to use constructor because I don't have any other operation to be performed here for now. So I'll leverage the constructor to give back the message whenever anyone creates an instance of it. So the messaging is part of the base. So whenever there's a base, it means that it's coming from its parent or inherited class. And then I'm going to say sample is null. My entity is null, whatever you're passing in. That's the message I want to give. This is all just pretty much alignment. I like it to be this way. Now, if you see, this base is again a method, which is a constructor for this, is going to pass in this parameter. If you have not taken a look at the code rub called parameter aliasing, do take a look. That's going to be helpful, and it'll have some links where you can understand what is parameter aliasing and when to use it. So here I see that this particular base method takes in the parameter name message, but what I'm passing in is not the equivalent name of it. So I'm going to alias it. Okay, this one looks good. These things will be cleaned up when I run the code cleanup, so I'm leaving it for now here. Otherwise, the shortcut is Control-KE, will clean up the file where you're currently in. Okay, good. So let's go here. Let me try to resolve it. It's still not able to detect that file. Why? It's because of this. So now let me go and make it public. Let's try now. Yeah, it's able to detect that, hey, this particular class is available in this particular namespace. Okay, I'm going to resolve it here. Since single line codes can be clubbed together just for cleanliness purpose, I'm just moving the line above. Okay, so now I've prepared my contract, which says this is the exception I'm going to expect when I'm going to pass in the null sample. Okay, we have another interesting concept. So let's get into the diagram, understand that first, and then come back to the coding. Okay, here we are, where we said this is going to be my exception or the message that I'm going to translate back whenever there's an error happening. Let's assume that there's another exception happening, right? As I said, the system has to handle all type of exceptions. So our system is reliable and it's easy for us to locate the error and support the issue when it happens. So if these are going to be the contracts that's going to be, given back to the caller, then there is going to be so many type of exceptions that's going to be traveling back or every call that's going to happening, right? So what I mean by that is this particular exposure should should receive this null sample exception and then handle it. And then this exposure should handle this, so on and so forth. So whatever exception that this layer is going to throw has to be handled here. Okay, so in this scenario, it might make sense that this exposure has to know exactly what the error is, so it is easy for us to give back the actual message. Let's take this view. So I'm going to duplicate this one here. Okay, let's assume that this exposure is not the caller for the foundation layer. Okay, let me break the chain here and let me move it out here. Okay, so for the simplicity purpose, we are just learning about our broker, foundation, and exposure, right? As the system grows, we'll have more complex logic coming in. Let's say, for example, you are preparing a system for registering a student for a class. So let's say a student is a minor. So whenever you're registering a student, you need a parent information or a guardian information to be saved so that for any further communications or for the fee structure, you can connect to the guardian rather than the student. This is one of a typical scenario, right? Wherever you go register your kid or your niece or nephew, this happens. Let's say now, for you to save a student, you're good, you go and save it. Let's assume that now you're going to save a guardian. Just think about it. Do you want to save a guardian only when a student is created? Or do you want to keep a guardian without even having a student? Does that make sense for your system? So in that case, we are going to have a business logic or code to check, hey, whenever I'm going to save my guardian data, I'm going to verify if the student for whom I'm going to save the guardian is already in the system. In that case, we will be having, a couple of more services in the pipeline before going to the exposure in between the foundation. So let's assume this, right? So we have a couple of more services. This service, right? In this case, let's assume now we have our error that is going to happen at the foundation layer. So this service who's going to call the foundation service may not be interested in the actual message, because this service might think, I'm not going to act upon it. I'm not expecting to handle all type of failures because the scope of my work in this service is something else. I don't want to handle this. So I don't want, cumulative individual messages, which is not going to make sense for me to handle it. Whereas this layer might be interested in those type of exceptions, or this layer might be interested in the other set of exceptions, right? So here what we have seen is we're going to localize the exception. So whenever there is an error happening, we're going to localize into our own exception. Here what we're going to see is we're going to categorize these exceptions. So anything that is related to validations. So let me get another box here. So what I'm going to say is this is going to be my validations exception. So that's the first grouping or the bucket that I'm going to create and say whenever there is a error in my expected business logic, I'm going to categorize them into validation. So now what I can place is I'm going to place the null. Okay, to back, yeah. So now I can paste this null sample exception into my validation bucket, and I can pass this validation bucket to the caller and say, hey, this is what you've called me with the data, and this is the error as per my contract. And this service who's going to receive that, depending on the interest or the scope of that service, it can either just pass along to the caller of it. So let me try to minimize it. Let me group it. Right click group. Yeah. So let me move this bit down. So let's assume that this is going to be the error that's getting thrown by the foundation layer, right? So this is the actual error. We have put that inside a box called validations. And then this is what the foundation layer is going to prepare. So now this foundation layer is just passing on this message to the caller. Now this service receives it. Depending on the interest and the scope of the service, it can either open this box, look inside what that error is, and handle it differently if there is a need. Otherwise, what this service can do is, hey, you call me with something, I performed my scope of work, and I called the next layer. The next layer gave me this, right? So in that case, what I want to do is I'll just pass on. I'm not interested to open the box and see what's happening here. So this service, again, depending on the scope and interest, it can either take a call to open up this box, look inside what that error is, and prepare its own message or workflow telling that, okay, now I see this is null. What shall I do next? What's my next workflow, and proceed there. Otherwise, again, this caller can just propagate this to whomsoever was it before, and then we can leave it there. So what we're trying to do here is categorizing the errors so that whenever there is a set of errors that's happening, we're putting it inside a higher level box. We are categorizing them into a group and saying that this is what you asked me to call. I'm giving you back this. If you're interested, look into it, act upon it. If not, pass along, right? So in that case, we are reducing the extensive amount of exceptions. Not just that. The workflows, that is the callers, can take a decision on the type of exceptions. So if this is going to be my this category, that's validation category of exceptions, then I will prolong with this next steps. If my category of exceptions is something else, we'll build these categories as we write our code. So let's say there is something else other than validation, then I'm going to treat this category of exceptions in such and such way. So this is going to really be helpful in all the pain points that you will have whenever an error occurs in the system. Okay, so now what we're going to do is prepare this particular box. Again, what we want here is the bucket list. And then this is again going to be an exception, right? So we suffix it with exception. Again, coming. So what if all the entities or all the workflows have validation exception, similar to this case, right? It's not going to make sense. So here what we're going to do is prefix it with entity. So this is going to be our, let me move it out. Okay, so this is going to be our entity, and then this is going to be our group. What is the grouping? So right now we are grouping under validations, and then this is an exception. So let's go fill that entity placeholder here. The entity that I'm going to work on is sample, right? So whenever the sample validation exception is being prepared, it needs to contain an inner exception. So it needs to have something inside it. So we call it in the term of inner exception. So these are all exceptions, right? So this is the outer exception. This is the inner exception. So now let's go write this particular class, which is going to contain this null exception. Okay. So now I'm going to prepare my box. That's the wrapper. That's the category. So I'm going to say sample validation exception equal new sample validation exception. And then I'm going to pass it the null sample exception. So if you are not ready to type it out all, you can either go create the model first and then type it out so you can get the IntelliSense or prediction around it. Fine. Since this is kind of going in a bigger than the test method, I would like to break it down so it kind of looks neat. And since this is a multi-line, my finger automatically went and gave a space, right? So all this is just for a pattern that is easing your eyes to look for the code where it's easy for you to read, right? So if you are being used to club everything together, pile it up together and then have it in one line so you're comfortable in scrolling to the right and see, that's up to your style. Okay, I feel this is good for my eyes. Okay, so now what we have done here is we have said this is going to be my wrapper, which is going to contain an inner exception. That's the null sample exception. So let's go prepare this. So same under models, under the entity, and under the exceptions. This is my class. So let me go create it. Okay, again, this is going to be freaking out of the access modifier. So let me change it out. And even this one is going to be of type exception. Okay. Similarly, whenever there is an instance or object getting created for this class, I want to pass in a message, which is going to be serving as the communication between the caller and the calling. So I'm going to leverage constructor for it. And this is my base class, which I'm going to pass in. I'm going to say sample validation error occurred. Fix the errors and try again. So this is validation exception, right? So they can fix it. So I'm just giving a generic message telling, hey, this entity validation error occurred, fix the errors and try again. Okay. So we're missing something. What we're missing is, let's get back to our test. So if we go here, it says this particular class does not contain a constructor that takes in one argument. Yes. What we wanted to do is wrap the inner exception. That's the wrap the actual exception into this, right? So we're going to receive the inner exception. So what is this type going to be? Inner exception. So for now, I'm not going to generalize it much. What I will do is null sample exception, right? Let's see if this is going to be happy. Yeah, it's happy. Just again, you can think about it. Do we want this as the type or something else? Let's get back to the diagram and see some more pictures to take the decision on what would be the best type for us to give here. Before that, let me fix the alignments. Okay, and this is the parameter aliasing. The other thing is when this exception is happening, we want to pass along that exception so that the trace is there for whatever is happening. So the constructor will help you with it. this one has another parameter which takes in the actual exception. So if you over here, it's the message and then it's the inner exception. So here I'm not parameter, aliasing because the parameter name and the variable name are the same. Okay. So far what I've done here is when anyone is going to call me the wrapper, that's the outer layer of the exception, I'm going to take in the inner exception and I'm going to wrap it up. And then this is my message and I'm passing along the inner exception for the traces. Okay. In the interest, let me hit a breakpoint here, right click, debug. So let's just take a look at the variable that we have prepared and how does it look like. Okay, yeah. So if I hover the sample validation exception, it shows me that sample validation error occurred, fix the errors and try again. Let me open this one. And then we packed it up with something, right? It has to hold something. So if I expand the inner exception, here I could see that sample is null. So this is how the system understands that this is the exception. If you open inner exception, this is the next exception. So this is what I wanted. Okay, let's stop here and get to our diagram. So what we have seen so far is this sample validation exception is going to hold null sample exception, right? Let's say another type of validation exception happens. Now I want to place it here, right? Now, if you see, this is of type null sample exception. This is another type. And this can also be another type, right? So you can have more than one type of exception that will help you out. Sorry, just give me one. Expand. Yeah. So here, what it says is for the same box, for the same group sample validation exception, I can have many individual type of exceptions. So if that's the case, will I be creating all the constructor like sample validation exception takes in constructor of this type, takes in the constructor of this type, takes in the constructor of this type? Not really. We have a scope of optimization here. So what are these types? We can group them all together because every one is coming from the same type, that is exception. So I can go and say, hey, this particular wrapper takes in of type exception. So that we're ensuring that the outer layer is always being passed with our own type of exception. That tomorrow, if something else happens, we have a handle of the actual exception to be modified. The other reason why we have to do this, right? To avoid the multiple constructors, to say this is one of the constructor that receives this type of exception, another constructor, right? So now, if you're not able to understand this, fine, do not change the contract for the input, finish it up. And next time when we do another exception, we will actually have that sense out of it. Let's get back to the coding. So this is the reason what I want to do is change this into type exception. So I'm generalizing that this validation exception will handle all type of exceptions. Okay, so far it's good. Now we have prepared our when section and the given section. There's some piece missing. So you have prepared what you're going to validate against, right? So I can rename this one to be my expected. So I'm expecting this expected sample validation exception so that when this method is going to throw me back an error, I have a handle already to compare, right? Similar to what we did in the happy path. Now coming to here, this one is going to give you back something. So you again have to hold that in a variable, right? So this one is going to be action. There's something going to happen here. So I'm going to say the variable name as add sample action. And I'm going to execute the action. It says, hey, this particular action variable is going to hold this. You know, that's the syntax for it. So far, we are good. What we have done is I prepared what I'm going to expect. So I'm going to validate with against. And I prepared, let me remove this. So I've prepared the testing method to pass the invalid data, and I'm going to expect back something. Yeah, I know this is a long video. We have a lot of new information to digest around. So I'm going to, give a pause here so that you kind of process the thoughts around what is the type of, test cases that we're going to write. That's validation test cases. And then what's the first type of validation that we're going to pass in? The next thing is what is the contract that's going to happen when the error happens? Why are we going with very specific type of exceptions? Then what is our interest of wrapping it up, right? So that's the other thing. The last one is where are we going to hold it so that we are ready to compare this, right? Yeah, I think in the next video, we will write our then section and complete our successful failing test and follow up from fixing it. Since it's not a commit, even then just go analyze, run code cleanup, which keeps it clean. Okay, see you all then in the next video.